Hi folks, Jeff Sengstack here. I'm going to talk about tonality adjustments. Adjusting tonality is the first step when you do color correction. Following any tonality adjustments, you then do color work. And we're going to focus specifically on tonality, which is brightness and contrast. Some people may dispute that tonality equals brightness and contrast, but it's a term that's commonly used and we'll use it in this tutorial. When you adjust tonality, your goal is to expand the contrast, to increase the contrast ratio. You want to have areas in the image that are absolutely black and areas in the image that are absolutely white, and then kind of a range of brightness in between. The thing is, you can look at a clip and say, "Oh, that really looks good," and I think it's a good representation of a full range of contrast. And your eyeballs will fool you. So it's best when you do any kind of tonality adjustments to use one of the scopes that comes with Premiere Pro. And the scope we'll use is called a waveform scope. So let me show you that waveform scope first. And to get there, you can either change your workspace to color correction by going up here, workspace, color correction, and that'll add an additional monitor, basically. In addition to the program monitor and the source monitor, it'll add another monitor called the reference monitor, and it'll all be built into the workspace. But I prefer working with a floating reference monitor, so I'm going to go this way by going Window, clicking reference monitor. That adds this floating panel with the reference monitor in it. And right now it's showing the exact same thing that you would see on the timeline. If I move this forward, you'll see we go to the next clip and everything's all lined up. That's because the reference monitor, first of all, is ganged to the program monitor. This little button down here gangs it to the program monitor, meaning what you see in the program monitor you see here, and you do want that to be the case. You want to have the scopes here show you what's going on in the program monitor. But the next thing you have to do, of course, is switch to a scope. And the way you access the scopes is through this drop-down menu, the panel menu. All panels have these little drop-down menus in the corner. You can see them there in each corner. And every panel menu is different depending on the panel that's open. In this particular case, this is a monitor, and all monitors have basically the same drop-down menu. That is, right now we're in composite video, but we want to see the scopes. Now I could show you just the waveform scope, but let me show you the 4 scopes that come with Premiere Pro. There you go, we've got the waveform, the vector scope, the YC Waveform, and the RGB Parade. But we want to work only with the waveform scope. That's the scope you use when you're working on adjusting tonality, brightness and contrast. So let me switch over to that scope. It's called the YC Waveform scope. It's called YC because it displays Y, which is Luma, and C, which is Chroma. And the default way that this thing opens is with this button checked and that checkbox turned on. The one on the right is Chroma, and it shows the Chroma values as a waveform for your clip, in addition to the bright areas here, the Luma values. Well, we're worried only about Luma, and the Chroma here is kind of confusing anyways and doesn't really work as it should. So we don't need to see Chroma here. We're not looking at Chroma, we're looking only at Luma. So turn that off. And the 7.5 IRE thing, this setup 7.5 IRE, that's an old standard for analog video and no longer applies to a digital high definition video. And so we'll just turn that off so we get actually an accurate representation of exactly what's going on in this clip. I'll turn that off and you'll watch this thing will shift a little bit. Okay, so now we've got the waveform set up the way we want it set up. And you'll just take a look at it for a while and you'll see that what the waveform does is it shows Luma values, meaning brightness basically, from left to right. If you see this kind of slope there as it goes up to the right, that's representing the brightness of the sky. The sky is relatively bright compared to everything else in the photo or in the clip. And you see that as you go to the right side, it gets brighter, and as you get brighter, it goes up the scope. The 0 down on the bottom is black. That means things in the clip are absolutely black. Not dark gray, black. And the top up here at 100, anything that touches 100 is going to be absolutely white. It'll have no detail. It'll be a highlight. It'll be pure white with no detail inside it. And so you typically want to get your Luma range, your contrast ratio, your brightness, to go from 0 to 100 with some stuff in between as well. So looking at this clip right away, you can see that this is underexposed. It's too dark. We've got plenty of stuff at or near the 0 black line, the so-called shadow line or the black line. But we've got nothing up here toward the 100 IRE line. IRE, by the way, if it says IRE somewhere there, IRE stands for International Radio Engineers. It's just a unit of measurement for brightness from 0 to 100. If you were working in PAL, it would be different numbers, but it would be similar. At any rate, we want to get this guy up to 100, and we can see that there's a big gap there. This clip is clearly underexposed. Let me take a look at a couple more clips. Here's one where it's also underexposed. It's not down to the black though. It's not. There's no dark shadows here. It's all kind of washed out if you look at it. You can tell that wasn't exposed properly. And the bright areas are only below 80. That's not very bright. So we want to lift the bright areas up, drop the dark areas down in that one. This is way underexposed. These two areas here are areas of the sky. And the sky should be much brighter than just 40. We want to get those guys up more toward 80 here in this case. And then this bridge, we got this bunch of stuff here along the top that's just about touching the 110 line. Now the thing about HD camcorders these days is that even though at 100 you no longer have detail when you see an image with a brightness value of 100, you can have recordings that record up to 110 IRE and still have detail. It's just that it's hidden until you bring it down. These areas are called super whites from 100 to 110 IRE. If you happen to overexpose your clip when you're videotaping or videoing and have your values here between 100 and 110, you can still get detail in them as long as you bring these values down using an effect. And so even though that's just pure white up there, you bring these guys down, there'll be a little bit of detail after we bring them down. And also, it's not quite dark enough here. We need to bring this guy down later. And this next clip is too dark. Here, you can barely see the vines, but the sun here, the sunset, is peeking out at 100 already. So if we want to fix this, we want to fix only the dark areas and not touch the bright areas. And then finally, this last one, here's some fog. You can see the fog right along there, just touching the 80 line. And this dark area down here is not quite dark enough. We're going to want to darken up this area without darkening the fog any. We might want to lift the fog a little bit. So that's kind of the plan of attack when we do any work to try to adjust tonality. There are two effects that I recommend you work with when you adjust tonality. One is the Fast Color Corrector, and the other is RGB Curves. Now I work with color correction so often, and I think you should work with color correction in all of your projects, that I keep my color correction effects here in a separate folder that I made, a custom folder of color correction effects. And there's the Fast Color Corrector, and there's RGB Curves. If you haven't set up something like this, then you can create your own custom bin and put effects in here just simply by dragging them in. But nevertheless, if you haven't set that up, you can always find those two color correction effects in the color correction folder or the color correction bin underneath video effects. So if I just open that up real quickly, you'll see under color correction we've got the Fast Color Corrector right there, and RGB Curves down a little bit farther. Now when most people think about adjusting tonality, brightness and contrast, if they've worked in Photoshop, then they think, well, why don't I work with levels? I mean, Premiere Pro has the levels effect. It's tucked away here in the adjust folder, the adjust bin. There's levels right there. Why don't we use levels? Well, in fact, levels doesn't work very well at all inside Premiere Pro. This particular version of levels is not a very good effect, and let me give you a quick demo as to why. I'm going to switch over to Photoshop. Here's that same clip that we had at the beginning in Photoshop, and here's levels is applied to it. And I want to show you how to adjust levels to compensate for the fact that this is kind of underexposed. Normally when you work with levels, you take the first of all the black input slider right there on the left hand side, and you move it to the right until it touches the edge of this little hill. In this case, though, the hill is right up smacked against there. You got lots of blacks in there already, so we don't want to slide it over and make anything blacker, so we don't do anything there. That's input. But the output side, we might want to just take the output down a little bit so the blacks are not quite so darn dark, because there's so much dark black here. So you might want to adjust the output a little bit to make it not quite so black. That's what output does. Then you go to the input levels for white, and you drag the white or the highlights value over till it's at the base of the hill, essentially. And I'll do that and drag that over, and now we're bringing up the brightness of this thing. Notice the histogram doesn't change as you do this. It's not responding. It's not dynamic. It just sits there showing the original way that the clip looked or the image looked. Then finally you can adjust the midtones of the gamma to finish your adjustment of tonality. This is more an eyeball kind of a thing. You get the two ends worked out, the highlights and the shadows, the blacks and the whites, and then you adjust the gamma to suit your taste, basically. So I think I'll just make it a little bit darker. Notice in Photoshop, when you move it to the right toward the bright areas, it gets darker, which seems kind of counterintuitive, and toward the black it gets lighter. In Premiere Pro, it's the opposite, a more logical direction. So that's how levels looks in Photoshop. If I go back to Premiere, I've applied levels to this clip right over here. Let's go to the Effect Controls panel. There we go. And I've applied levels to this clip already, this bridge shot. And I have not turned it on. Right now it's turned off, because I want you to watch something. See this the scope view of this thing, right along the top there, everything is pretty bright. That's the sky. It's above 100. And if I just applied levels, I'm going to turn it on, which mimics applying it. If I just turn it on, watch what happens there. Just the fact that I add levels to that clip knocks the brightest areas down to 100. You don't manually get to do that. It does it for you automatically, which is a bad thing. There shouldn't be any automatic stuff going on when you apply an effect. It just should sit there in neutral. So that's not a good thing that it does that. And also, if you look at the levels control, it looks a lot like the levels control inside Photoshop. Look at the histogram. It's like non-existent. There's no way you can use the histogram graphically to decide where to move the input sliders to try to decide what works right. And as you change things, they just change in this little box here. They don't change over here in this window until you actually close this, and then the changes show up there. So levels is not really an effective tool inside Premiere Pro. It's basically been preempted by newer effects that have been added more recently, and the most obvious choice for that is the Fast Color Corrector. So I'm going to walk you through the Fast Color Corrector in a couple of clips, and then I'll show you the RGB Curves in a couple other clips. So we'll go back to the first clip, and we'll apply the Fast Color Corrector to this first clip, Coast MPG here, or MPEG. Drop it over there, and notice nothing happens. No weird stuff happens here, and nothing happens in terms of how the image looks. It sits there in neutral waiting for you to work on it. If I open it up, you'll see that it has a lot of stuff going on. I'll expand the view here so you can see things better by clicking this little chevron to get rid of the mini timeline. So there you go. Now you can get a better look. It has a big color wheel and a bunch of other things, but our focus here, almost exclusively, is on these levels style sliders, just like the levels sliders inside Photoshop. We have input and we've got output. So what we want to do here is look at this at the scope and decide what do we want to do. Well, first of all, we want to bring the blacks down just a smidge, so we get the blacks just down a touch more. If you look here on the right side, that little green line goes below zero, and what that means is there are areas in here that are blacker than zero, but you can't. They're not showing up in the scope. They're so small they don't even show up in the scope. So we're not going to sweat that there's some stuff below zero. We're just going to bring this guy down just a touch. And to bring things down, bring black down, to make it darker, you take the input slider and drag it to the right. So just that little bit is all we'll do. Just bring it down slightly there, that's all. Now we need to bring the bright level up. And the way you bring the bright level up is take the input level and bring it to the left. That lifts the bright areas. And we'll see the scope as it goes up as I drag left. I'm going to drag it up so that the brightest area in the clip, the top of that little curve, just touches the 100 line. And there you go. Now we have now changed it such that the brightest area in the clip are 100, pure white. The darkest areas in the clip are black, or 0, pure black. And we've got a lot of contrast in between. And the picture looks better as a result just by doing that. I'll show you the before and the after. Here's the before. Here's the after. It looks much better. And then finally, if you want to adjust the gamma, what they call the gray level here inside Fast Color Corrector, you can just drag this left or right. Left goes darker, right goes brighter. As you'd expect, it's a little more intuitive than Photoshop, I believe. So I just took it down just a smidge there, or took it up a little smidge to make it a little bit brighter. And then the actual numeric values are down here below these little sliders, which is really good because all these numeric values are keyframeable. They all have these little toggle animation switches such that, let's say if you are following action and the action goes from a sunlit area to shade, you can always use levels to make adjustments if your camera didn't do that automatically. Alright, that's example one. Let's move on to the next one. This is a shot here where it's not dark enough and not bright enough. So we'll add the Fast Color Corrector to that. We'll go to the level style controls inside the Fast Color Corrector. And now what we need to do is first, whenever you do any tonality work, you always start with the blacks first. You always bring the blacks to the 0 line. So to do that, I need to use the input slider again to bring the blacks down, to get them just to touch the input, just to touch the 0 line. There we go. Right about there. Just if a couple go slightly below, that's right, because they're just minuscule areas in the clip that are going below. Now we need to bring the whites up, the highlights up to the 100 line. So I'll just drag the input for that up to the left to bring the values up, way up, just to get the highlights to touch the 100 line right about there. And look at the difference already just by changing the inputs for the blacks and the whites, the shadows and the highlights. I'll turn off the before and the after. It went from kind of muddy and diffuse looking to pretty crisp and pretty sharp, looking very nice. And again, you can adjust this make it darker or brighter to suit your tastes when you adjust the midtones or the grays or the gammas, they call it. Let's go on to one more clip. This particular case, we're way underexposed. You can see it's way dark. The highlights are only at 40 or so. That's very dark. I'll apply the Fast Color Corrector again, and we will just drop the values down slightly for the shadows, for the blacks. Bring those guys down by using input to bring them down just a touch. There we go. And now the issue is how far do we lift the highlights? Since this clip started out pretty dark to begin with, if we lift those guys all the way up to 0, all the way up to 100, it may look a little overdone, but we'll give it a shot. We'll just drag it across there and see what happens if I take it all the way to 100. Let's see how that looks. Up to 100, right about there. That's believable, I suppose. Notice that there's detail in the sky there, which is kind of nice. You thought maybe there's nothing at all there, but there's detail there. So we can take it up there, but usually when you've got something that's that underexposed, you may not want to bring the highlights all the way back to 100, but that's pretty good. But you notice that as we did that, it got kind of desaturated. It's kind of like the color information was kind of lost here because it was so underexposed. Well, one of the cool things about Fast Color Corrector is that it has saturation as one of the properties. So saturation is set at 100, which is meaning unchanged. That's the original value of whatever, however saturated it was to begin with. So because we lost some saturation because of the underexposure and then now the correct exposure, we just add some saturation. That can make it look better. So we'll just say maybe right around that. And I'll show you the before and the after. Before, after. So that's pretty good. Let's go to this next guy, another Fast Color Corrector tool. What I want to do is I've got a lot of bright areas here. I need to bring them down, which will be a different tack this time because we're not bringing things up to 100, we're bringing them down below 100. So I'll apply Fast Color Corrector again, and we'll go to its level style controls again. This time we need to bring the white levels down, not up to the 100, but down to the 100. And so you do that with the output slider down here, not with the input. Input, if I did that, it would just make things brighter. In this case, we don't want to make them any brighter, we want to make them a little bit darker. So this time we take the highlights, bring them down in the output levels, and you'll notice there goes the line in the scope. We'll get that down just so that it touches the 100 line, so that the sky isn't so blown out. And there's just a little bit of detail in the clouds there. It's really kind of hard to make out here in the monitor, but it's there. Now we need to bring the dark areas down, bring the shadows down. So again, we use input for that and bring the shadows down. And right about there, we've now got pleasing contrast. If we want to adjust the gamma, we can either make that up or down. Okay, now let's take a look at the last two clips because we'll use RGB curves on these, and here's why. You'll see that there's a real dark area here where those vines are. You can sort of barely make them out. And then the bright area, the sunset, is touching or a little bit above the 100 line. So I don't, when I raise the dark areas to make them a little brighter, I don't want to raise the highlights because it'll blow them out and take the colors out of the sunset and make them pure white. So I use RGB curves when I work with just a specific tonality region in a clip. Let me show you how that works. Go down to RGB curves, apply that to this clip. If you've worked with curves at all inside, let's say, Photoshop, then this will look kind of familiar. We're going to work only with the master graph, not the red, green, and blue graph, because the master graph represents the tonality area. Now, it works very much like levels in that the bottom here is black, or the shadows, and the top corner or the top side is white or highlights. And when I lift up this line, I'm going to be lifting the blacks. And when I pull down the top, I'm going to pull down the whites. So the opposite direction, if I go right on the blacks, that's going to bring the blacks up. And if I go left on the whites, that's going to lift the whites. So you can kind of see how that works. So I want to work, I'll just show you quickly how that works. So I take this guy and bring it down, watch the scope, you'll see the bright areas come down and the whole clip gets darker. Take that back. If I lift the blacks, you'll see the blacks come up on the scope and the whole scene gets brighter but washes out the blacks. So my goal is to just lift up this area here down around the 30% or so line and lift that up and make that area a little bit brighter without making the sky any brighter. So what I do is I put little marks here, little markers on the line to basically hold down this area of the graph so that that won't change. And by the way, little changes here on the graph do sort of change this look quite a bit. So I've got these guys kind of locked in. And I want to lift this part of the graph, let's say from about 30% up here, and this about 30% or so, and down. I want to lift that area and make it brighter. So I put a marker here 2 markers so that this whole thing won't move. And lift this guy up a little bit, and that will raise, watch the graph here, that'll raise the darker areas of the image and make the vines brighter without blowing out the sky. See how that works? We got just the sky is locked down here, but we did lift just the darker area of the clip so you can see the gnarled vines. Pretty slick, yes? Go on to this next guy and apply the RGB curves to that one as well. Here we've got a little issue where we want to make the dark areas darker because they're just not contrasty enough. There aren't any sharp shadows there. But we don't want to make the shadows, this fog darker. And we also maybe want to lift the fog just a little bit. So we'll use RGB curves to take care of that. Apply RGB curves to that. I applied it twice, didn't know that. We'll stick with one application, Jeff. Here's the master. We're going to lift up the fog just a little bit. So lift it up by dragging the top to the left, and that lifts things up just a little bit because the fog should be kind of bright, but not too bright. You don't want to make it as bright as like the brightest area with a sunny day because that wouldn't look like fog anymore. And now we want to take down the bottom, and if I drag the bottom to the right, that'll take down the bottom, but also kind of start shifting the fog as well, making the fog darker. I don't want to do that. I want to make just the bottom darker. So here if you look at the graph here, you see that at about 45% is where the darkest area in the clip is, 45 and down. So 45% is right about here on that line. So I'm going to put a marker above it to keep things from moving. And I'm also going to lock down some of these guys up here to make sure they don't move. And now I'm going to start clicking here and dragging down the darker areas to really begin to make some contrast in the bottom without blowing it up too much. So notice now that we've got the bottom is sharp, but the fog stayed at its nice foggy looking thing. So we got nice contrast down here without messing with the fog. So those are the 2 basic ways that you work with tonality in Premiere Pro. The Fast Color Corrector's levels style controls let you control the blackest areas, the shadows, and the brightest areas, the highlights, using those sliders, and then adjust the gamma, the midtones in the middle to fine-tune your tonality adjustments. And then RGB curves let you work within specific regions of tonality inside a clip here in Premiere Pro.